Good, I'm seeing nods, excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited, also very nervous. As Dr. Fisher said, we have been preparing for this for over a year, so it's a long time coming. I want to thank my mentor, Dr. Cassara, for being here today and helping me with this, as well as Mike Hoskins, who gave us the $5,000 to be able to do it. So before we begin, I briefly want to say that since I have come back from the West Bank, many people throughout my presentations have said, I wish you would have talked a little bit more about Israel. And I just want to clarify that I spent a month in the West Bank and I was only in Israel for the airport. So the stories that you will be hearing today are about Palestinian narratives in the occupied West Bank. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much. When I was 16 years old, I met one of my best friends. Her name is Haneen, and Haneen and I met in our homeroom class in high school, and Haneen was a new student from East Jerusalem. And when I was getting to know my friend a little bit better, it came out in conversation that her oldest brother, Ehab, was serving time in an Israeli prison. This kind of shocked me at first. As a 16-year-old in the US, we have an idea of what kind of person is supposed to be in a prison. But I realized that because my friend is such a good person, that her brother probably just made a mistake, and that I should let her go forth with the story as she saw fit. I didn't have to wait long, because a couple of months later, a beaming Haneen came into homeroom, and she told me, Michaela, Ahab has been set free, he is not in prison anymore. And she showed me pictures on her phone of Ahab riding on a white horse through the streets of East Jerusalem, with Palestinian flags all around him and a kufiye around his neck. And I finally got my courage up. I said, Haneen, why was he there in the first place? And I wish I could have known how her answer would have impacted my life, because she said, he threw rocks. You see, Ahab was in high school himself when he caught a rumor at school that an Israeli gang was going to burn down his neighborhood mosque. So he gathered his community members together and they sat in front of the mosque to protect it. And when the Israeli gang showed up and started firing their semi-automatic weapons, the community members took what they could from the ground and tossed it. As a result of this, the Israeli soldiers came a couple minutes later and arrested all the Palestinian men. And after that, Ahab would serve almost 2 years in Israeli prisons under torture and conditions that he doesn't like to talk about. A couple of days after we got this great news that he had been released, he was shot close range in the head by a rubber bullet, and we were told that he had died on impact. Thankfully, that turned out to be not the case, that he lived and he's doing well now, but a couple of months after he got out of the hospital and after he was released from prison, he was in his house sleeping in the middle of the night, and Israeli soldiers came to his house, put a black bag over his head, threw him in the back of a truck, and he wasn't heard from for a week. This family story changed my perspective on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I had just had a module in school on this conflict, and we hadn't talked about any of these kinds of stories. And for the first time, I wanted to know for myself why this was. Why wasn't I hearing these stories? And where were these stories that I could listen to, that I could read? It was very difficult. And I soon realized that if I wanted to know more about these stories, that I would have to go to Palestine myself and meet people there and hear their stories for myself. So with the help of the Hoskins Fellowship, that's exactly what I was able to do. Before we go any further, we need to talk a little bit about history and Palestinian perspective. The big map on here that you need to pay attention to is this one, UN Plan 1947-48. And with the creation of Israel, that subsequently meant that Palestinian land was being reduced. And so this is what it looked like in 1948, and subsequently the first modern refugee crisis was formed out of this. The second one that you need to pay attention to is this, 2010. And it says 2010, but this is what it arguably looks like today. Because of a very controversial topic in the conflict that deals with Israeli settlements, which furthers prospective Palestinian loss of land. There are 3 things. Are you telling me I have 5 minutes?
No, you just went 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you. I apologize. All right, okay. There are 3 things that really stick out to me when I first went to this area. The first one is when I left the Tel Aviv airport, I sat down in the bus that would take me to Jerusalem. An Israeli lady sat next to me, and we started talking after we quickly figured out my lack of Hebrew skills. And she started talking to me in perfect Darija Moroccan Arabic. And this dialect is very specific to the area I was studying in Morocco, so that blew me away. I was like, how do you know this? She said, well, my family's from there. So we continued talking a little bit, and she said, well, if you don't speak Hebrew, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm going to be working at a nonprofit organization in the West Bank in Nablus. And she said, Nablus, where's that? And I said, well, it's about an hour north of Ramallah, to kind of give her an idea of where things were. And she said, oh, I think we might have a different name for that. We continued talking and getting to know each other. And when it was time for me to get off the bus, she took my arm and said, Michaela, I just want to let you know that I know what we're doing in there, and I'm not okay with it. This was first day. The second thing that you notice the second you go into Palestine from Israel is you immediately recognize how clean Israel is. It looks very much like the United States, but the second you cross the checkpoint and go into Palestine, you see mounds and mountains of garbage. And I asked one of my colleagues why this was, because it didn't appear to me to be the typical developing country litter that you see. And he said, yes, it's partly because that we're new, we're trying to be a state, but part of it is because Israel controls the trash removal, and they jack up the price so much that it's too expensive for Palestinians to remove their garbage properly. So I thought that was interesting. The third thing was the water. Now, researchers believe, many do, that water has become a source of conflict in the Palestinian conflict, and that's why we see it manifested the way it is in the modern day. Palestine has many aquifers underneath the soil, and Israel uses the water. But subsequently, this means that Palestinians have an average of 21 liters per person per day to use. But we know that the World Health Organization says you need at least 25 to bathe, to clean, to make food. Your daily use of water needs to be about 25 liters. But this creates 600 liters of water for the average Israeli person to use per day. Again, interesting. But while I was in Palestine, I was working at an organization, a nonprofit called Project Hope. And Project Hope was founded in the early 2000s during what we call the Second Intifada, or the second major uprising of Palestinian people against the occupation. And Palestinian families in Nablus were very concerned that because of the increased shellings and curfews in the refugee camps surrounding Nablus, that their kids weren't getting enough education. And so they created Project Hope as a means to achieve that. And so it started out as a math class, as language arts, as science, and then it has grown since then to include international volunteers like myself teaching their native languages. So we had English, French, Turkish sometimes, and a wide range of topics from coding to photography to dance. I taught dance as well. And my job there was to teach a kindergarten class, 2 adult classes, and 2 adolescent dance classes on the weekends. But the group that I learned the most from was definitely my kindergartners. In my kindergarten class, we had over 60 children, and it was just me. We were running all over the place, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, till we were blue in the face. Just anything to dispose of that energy that was just constant. But I soon realized that I was perceiving a very distinct separation between my kids. I could see, perceived, that the children that lived in the refugee camps acted very differently than the ones that lived in downtown Nablus. And that led me to look at the refugee camps. The largest camp in the West Bank is called Baleta, and Baleta is home to 37,000 individuals in under 1 square mile of land. So these are a few pictures that I have from here. A colleague, when looking at this photo of mine, said there's probably about 30 families living here. The average family size is 10 people in Baleta, so a lot of people. This is a street, if you can believe that. That is a street in Baleta camp. It's largely made up of little mazes like this. And my colleague there is probably standing about 6'3", and his shoulders are almost touching both sides of the wall. Give you a little bit of idea of what this looks like. One of the most impactful stories that I heard was in a refugee camp outside of Bethlehem, where I met a boy named Omar, who is 12 years old. He took me to the spot and told me that when he was 10 years old, he was sleeping and Israeli soldiers came to his house, put a black bag over his head, and put him in the car. He says that they drove and drove and drove, and he was terrified. When he finally took that black bag off, he realized that he was in an Israeli prison, and that when they put a white paper in front of him, written entirely in Hebrew, he can't read Hebrew, he remembered his brother saying, if you're in this situation and they put this paper in front of you, do not sign it. Because if you do, you're signing a statement that says you've committed a crime, and you probably haven't committed it. So don't sign this paper. So he didn't. But that ultimately resulted in him being electrocuted, and the soldiers beating him and doing sleep deprivation for almost 2 weeks. But he was very lucky because he got out and he's okay now. But his friend Mahmoud isn't so lucky because Mahmoud was taken around the same time, but he was burned so badly on his groin that he will not be able to have children. They're 10-year-old boys. This is a picture I took in Bethlehem. When I first saw this boy, his back was to me, facing all these tourists that you can see here, and he was making pew 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 noises. And he turned around. I snapped this photo and I went up to him. He doesn't have shoes on, if you can see in this picture. And I went to him, I was like, you know, you shouldn't be out here doing this. Where are your shoes? You should go inside. And he said something like, okay, whatever, Grandma, and waved on. But another story that reminds me a lot about this picture is when I was walking through Baleta camp, and the camp closest to my house, and a young boy threw a Molotov cocktail at my back. And I turned around, surprised, and I looked at him and he was laughing. And I've talked about this situation before because I think it's so intriguing. My thought process at that moment was more of, I wish that he had been in Project Hope with us that day. Because the incredible thing about organizations like Project Hope is that they respond to these movements where it's really, really easy and understandable why children in these conditions would turn to radicalized movements. It's a self-help mechanism. But Project Hope gets these kids out of camps and out of downtown Nablus and says, learn a language. Tell somebody what your experience is like in their own language. Be a chemist. Lead the way in Palestinian science so that when we do have a nation, we're prepared for what's coming. Be a historian. Take notes. Take pictures. Here's a camera. Express yourself, right? My favorite story of all, though, was when I was walking through a refugee camp outside of Ramallah with my colleague named Chidem from Turkey. She took this photo. And we were walking through the streets and we saw these boys celebrating with Palestinian flags. And we walked up to them and they kind of just stopped and looked at me. And they were like, Enti fi Israel? Are you from Israel? I was like, no, I'm not from Israel. I'm an American. I'm here in Palestine to just see the place. And they were like, oh, that's really cool. Are you going to be here for when the prisoner comes home? And I said, the prisoner. And they're talking about a man who had served time in an Israeli prison and was coming home. And I said, I didn't know that was happening. Yeah, we'll stick around. And so he invited us to his house where we drank coffee and hung out with his family for a little bit. And it was getting kind of late. I'm looking at my watch, it's about 8 o'clock. I'm like, children, it's almost time to go home. Like, we gotta go. And my friend was like, no, just wait a couple more minutes. He'll be here. And at that moment, we heard gunshots go up on either side of the house, and his little sister stands up and goes, oh, the prisoner is here! Runs over to the window, throws open the blinds, and starts looking around, so we go downstairs. And it was incredible. The whole camp, it seemed, was on this street. And as tradition holds, the prisoner, I don't actually know his name, I apologize, but the prisoner was in a car with his father on a perpendicular street, and then his mother was waiting at the end to bring him traditionally back to the house. And so we watched this happen, and everybody was going nuts. We were so excited. The prisoner came home, right? And it seemed to me that a couple seconds after we took this picture, his mother lifted her chin a little bit. And it's such a simple movement, but to me, the world went quiet around me because that little motion held a million different things that she really wanted to say. It was how proud she was of her son, how happy she was that he had survived these prisons, and that he looked relatively healthy. She was happy that her son came home, but she was proud of her identity as a Palestinian. And gunshots and red flares went up again in celebration, like this one. They're shooting blanks, that's what this is. And it rained down on the street, but it was one of the most incredible moments I have ever experienced. Palestinian stories are really important to pay attention to. In the United States, we are often told a certain narrative about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but it's important to always question the narratives that we're told. Keep asking questions, because it's when we let go and decide to just listen to whatever is being told to us instead of searching for ourselves that we become stagnant and we stop learning, and that's dangerous. Project Hope and other organizations like it give me a lot of hope for the future of these children, for the future of Palestine, and in general, for humanity in general. And I hope that that's the same for you as well. Thank you.